urgency is perhaps the biggest and most urgent topic we've looked at yet, and it is clear that our current political system is not equipped to tackle a problem of this scale, nor with the speed necessary. It is, in fact, the main reason why I do what I do, campaigning for PR, because I think we urgently need to tackle the climate crisis. We need a government that genuinely reflects the diversity of our society and the urgent demand for climate action. With proportional representation, we can make sure that the voices of those who care about the planet are heard loud and clear. Before I introduce our wonderful guest speakers to take these arguments forward, a few brief bits of housekeeping. We'll begin with short presentations from each speaker, after which we'll open up for Q&A. So please raise your hand and a microphone will be brought to you if you're in the room, or if you're watching online, you can submit your questions via the Q&A function on Zoom. Please accept our sincere apologies if the live stream quality is not perfect. There have been a few unforeseen glitches, but hopefully it's working okay. A full recording will be made available after the event if you do want to rewatch or listen. So with that covered off, I'm delighted to be joined by our four distinguished speakers for the evening. Baroness Natalie Bennet entered the House of Lords in 2019 as the second Green peer after being leader of the party in England and Wales from 2012 to 2016. Natalie is a long-time champion of Make Votes Matter and recipient of the Equal Votes 2022 Parliamentary Award. Her forthcoming book, Change Everything, Common Sense Politics for the Age of Shocks, puts reforming the UK's archaic, dysfunctional and undemocratic constitution at its heart. Liz Saville-Roberts is the Plaid Cymru leader in the House of Commons and MP for Dwyfor, Meirionnydd, which I'm probably saying wrong. Liz was first elected in 2015 as the first woman to represent the constituency and Plaid Cymru's first female MP. As Westminster leader, a position Liz has held since 2017, she speaks for the party on home affairs, transport, women and equalities, business, energy and industrial strategy and justice. And she's also done all sorts of work with us for Making Votes Matter over the years. Over to Clive Lewis, who is back up the page. He is the Labour MP for Norwich South. Since being elected in 2015, Clive has gone on to become a familiar face in the movement for constitutional reform and environmental protection. This includes being a member of the Environmental Audit Committee, co-chair of the APPG on the Green New Deal and co-founder of the Global Alliance for a Green New Deal, as well as a long-standing ally of Make Votes Matter, a great friend to us. And last but definitely not least, we have Dave Timms, as he's Head of Political Affairs at Friends of the Earth, England, Wales and Northern Ireland, where he leads the political, legal and planning team. Most recently, Dave has focused on Friends of the Earth campaigning to defend civic space, including opposing legislation to restrict campaigning by NGOs during elections and threats to the right to protest, including the use of injunctions by the fossil fuel industry and the Police and Crime Sentencing and Courts Act. So, without further ado, I will pass over to the speakers for the presentations. We will be hearing from Natalie, Dave, Liz and Clive in that order. So, Natalie, please take it away.
Okay, well, I think, thank you very much, Kleiner, and thanks, Make Votes Matter. And I couldn't possibly have planned it better in terms of timing, because I've literally just come fresh from the House of Lords, where the government has been getting a thumping in the public order bill, including, of interest to Dave, an amendment that I was sitting behind my fellow Green peer Jenny Jones, talking about an amendment that aims to protect journalists' right to cover protests, which very much relates to the arrest of an LBC journalist at a Just Stop Oil protest a little while ago. And it allows me to say one of my favourite fun facts, fun claims that people like to argue with about our current constitution, which I would say the UK is not a democracy. And I think this is a nice demonstration of that, because actually the House of Lords, with its 92 hereditaries, with its bishops, with its utterly archaic appointment system, is more representative of the country than the Commons is. Because still, despite the stream of Tories coming into the House, still the crossbenchers just have the balance of power. And the crossbenchers, the non-party people, if they get together with the other opposition, can block what the government wants. And we've just seen that this evening again and again and again. So And I've also, the other thing that I'm very excited about tonight is I actually have a new argument for proportional representation in the lower house. And, I've been talking about this for a long time, but this actually comes from, many people might have seen the report on the BBC last week. A score of economists wrote to the BBC and said the way you're covering debt is biased, is slanted towards the idea that debt is automatically a bad thing and we have to have less debt. And economists are saying that doesn't reflect a broad spread of economic opinion. And the BBC has now acknowledged that there are some flaws in that. And one of the things that struck me as I was sitting down and writing and thinking about this was what I have seen so often and driven me wild, but I've never seen it quite framed so clearly, is the fact that the BBC thinks they've got balance when they've got a Labour and a Tory person. That's balance. And I think back to the first time I did Question Time, and I went into the Question Time event with some expert advice on my ears saying, be careful not to interrupt people because the audience don't like women interrupting. And, it comes out really badly in social media. And so I didn't interrupt. And afterwards people came out and said, were you on it? I didn't actually see you on this. And what I came to realise, it's quite different to any questions, partly because it's radio, so they can't have people yelling over the top of each other because it just sounds like a mess. In any questions, which I'd done a few times, you got your quarter of the space. It was, the chair made that happen. But on Question Time, which Dimbleby was it? I always muddle them up. Whichever Dimbleby it was at the time, was of that political generation that thought, Labour and Tory, that was it, that was the two sides. And you only got in as something else if you fought your way in. And, the second time I went on Question Time, I fought my way in. Now, where I think this is particularly relevant when we're talking tonight about climate is the fact that if you think about what, we've come a long way. It was the BBC journalist was asking me last week, don't you feel like, you're struggling for a place when everyone's talking about the climate now? And it's like, no, I think we've won the argument, so that's a really good starting point. But more than that, of course, they talk the climate, but they don't, from my perspective, deliver the climate action. But the BBC is the worst offender, but it's true right across the media, think that if we're going to, mainly cover climate, well, Labour and Tory are talking about climate now, so that's what we've got to have to talk about climate. And so when we think about the impact of the first past the post system in the Commons, the way that impacts on climate is that it only really grabs a very narrow part of the argument. And one of the things, there's been quite a lot of coverage in the last week or so also about net zero. And as Greens, we've had to make a choice about the phrase and the decision net zero and 2050 net zero. And, net zero implies offsetting. Now, my basic line on offsetting is a con. We have to stop both emitting the carbon, mostly from fossil fuels, and plant the trees, store the carbon in the soil and all the rest of it. It's not an either or, and the whole framing of net zero is within that offsetting frame. But, we've made a conscious decision that we don't try and take that to the BBC and whatever, because we just know we're not going to get anywhere. We've got to fight within the frame of what we can actually get to. And my thesis for this evening is that first past the post actually really restricts our debate on climate and what can get onto the mainstream media. So I'll leave it there for the discussion.
Thanks very much. Great. I'm going to pass over to Dave Timms, and I think what I'm going to do from now on is I'm going to give you a timed slot, because we did start a little bit late, and I know you've been asked it perhaps, so I'm going to have a 4-minute timer running.
Sorry, I didn't think I was that much over, but it's hard
you're fine. You're fine. I'm just realising I need to chair.
Right. Thank you, Clive, and thank you very much for inviting me. Simple truth is one of the most overworked phrases in politics, but in contrast to the huge complexity predicting the impact that rising temperatures will have on society, ecosystems and economics, there is a simple truth that those who did the least to cause the problem suffer the worst from its effects. That, in a nutshell, is climate justice. The historic responsibility for climate change lies with wealthy and powerful people and nations, yet disproportionately, its impacts will fall on the poorest and most vulnerable in the planet and in our society. North America and Europe created nearly half the global emissions since 1850, despite being about 15% of the population. The richest nations both caused the problem, in our case while extracting massive wealth from large parts of the rest of the world, and now have the resources and capabilities to deliver the solutions at home and to support others. It's our responsibility, and that's climate justice. Low-income countries are the most vulnerable to natural disasters accelerated by climate change and without the resources to cope with them. Just for example, Pakistan, in the run-up to the UN negotiations last year, climate negotiations, COP last year in Sharm el-Sheikh, 1/3 of Pakistan was underwater at parts in the run-up to those negotiations. Bangladesh saw 2.5% of its population displaced by climate disasters in 2019. And those who are the most oppressed within societies, women, indigenous people, for example, bear the brunt even further. So climate change isn't the great leveller, it's the great multiplier, acting negatively with the forms of inequality that already scar our societies and the planet. And this battle for justice has been the defining feature of international climate negotiations for the past 30 years, led by the voices of the Global South. Written into the 1992 UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is that nations have common but differentiated responsibilities. But putting this into practice has proved hard, with rich countries consistently avoiding their historic responsibility over successive rounds of negotiations. In Egypt, even a funding mechanism for addressing this loss and damage caused by wealthy nations was agreed, but no money inside of it. And so what's true and international is also true within nations. The term climate justice has its roots further back with environmental justice, the movement that grew in the US in the 1970s and 1980s in response to black communities seeing toxic pollution dumped disproportionately in their neighbourhoods. And here we saw the tragic death of young Ella Kissy Deborah, and her mother's tireless campaigning has become a rallying point on the impact of dirty air. Air pollution disproportionately impacts low-income areas and particularly affects neighbourhoods with higher ethnic minority populations. People of colour are over 3 times more likely to live in a highly polluted area than white people. Yet households with very high air pollution, subjected to very high air pollution, are 3 times less likely to own a car than those in the least polluted areas. Similarly, those who will suffer the extreme temperatures like we saw last summer and living in those high-risk neighbourhoods have lower than average carbon footprints.
30 seconds.
30 seconds, okay. So when climate change is expressed in this way, as an issue of justice, of fairness, of rights, and of power, rather than a question of parts per million and polar bears, then the link to a fair voting system, the deep democratic reform, becomes not just obvious, but absolutely essential.
Thank you very much. Wonderful, and I'd love to hear from you now, Liz.
Right,
please.
thank you very much, Lena. Obviously, because I am Plaid Cymru, it will probably come as no surprise to you that I'm going to talk about Wales. But the need to talk about different democracies within the United Kingdom and how they are developing in different ways and what those differences actually manifest as, I think is something that's very important that we should be doing here in the centre. When, as Natalie said, you were talking about first past the post being actually less democratic than the House of Lords, and this reality of what is assumed to be the norm within the British state of a duality of approach between Labour and Tories, if you like, swapping between themselves, how much we lose within our democracy and how much we lose within the wider voices that should be made present. Now, devolution in Wales is described from the very beginning as being a process rather than an event. And it does strike me that we're in the Sir Godfrey Mitchell, which I Googled quickly, and he was a construction engineer. And that sense that we are always rebuilding our democracy, and we're building something which is the risk of it being inherently conservative, but we need to build it to face the challenges ahead of us. And just to touch on some of the differences that are already in existence in Wales, that we have, of course, votes at 16 for our Senedd elections, and we will not have voter ID on all those elections which we manage, so those other than general elections and the police and crime commissioners. I think one major piece of really significant legislation which has been raised here by John Bird in the House of Lords is the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, Welsh legislation from 2015. Now again, how this will actually roll out and the influence it has in what will the impact be on future generations and how that then can affect legislation in the here and now, and the operation of that legislation in the here and now will be a constant test. But the fact that that test has to be asked within the Senedd in Wales, I think, is a very significant piece to moving ahead. Now, just to describe the nature of votes in Wales at present, similar to that in Scotland, we have, for the 40 constituency elections, first past the post, but we also return 20 the regional members by the semi-proportional additional member system. Now, I am excited to say that in cooperation, we have the cooperation agreement between my party, Plaid Cymru, and Welsh Labour government. There's actually a series of voting reforms being brought in Wales, which includes the adoption of a full list set of Senedd elections. I'll speak probably, if there's any more questions on this, I can go into a touch more candidly, but nonetheless, the great groundbreaking nature of this, in the sense that it breaks the pool table and sends the balls in all directions, is it actually will be the first nation in Britain to abolish the first past the post system. And I think that major change, I hope, will then lead on to other issues, other areas which we will be able to improve and bring into government and effect a plurality of voices which we really need to strengthen our democracy. My party does remain fully committed to STV, but as I said, the enemy of don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. There are other aspects of I think, greater cooperation. One of the things, again, alongside the change in voting methodology which is being proposed for 2026, the next Senedd election, is also to increase the number of members. Now, I'll leave it here with that, but for me, I mean, you imagine going out there arguing for 96 as opposed to 68 Senedd members, or if you like, Welsh MPs. Yeah, not an easy job, but we will get a better democracy. There will be better scrutiny, there will be better holding to account, there will be more voices. And though these steps are tiny, and we all of us want to take giant steps, it's better that we take the tiny steps than that we don't take none at all.
Thank you. Over to you, Clive.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me here tonight. It's a pleasure to speak on an issue that's very close to my heart. I think there's a great number of people inside the Labour Party, I'm pleased to say, who share my views on proportional representation and increasingly on the wider crisis of democracy, which I think this is something which PR taps into. It's the tip of that iceberg, if you want. I was listening to Natalie talk about the fact that she's writing a book on the UK's constitution, or non-written constitution, or however you want to define it. But one of the things a term I came across a little while ago when I was writing an article on republicanism during the transfer of power from one hereditary monarch to the other, which took place, I think, there was no consent in it. It was actually quite forced. Maybe some of you agree with that, I don't know. But it tells you a lot about our democracy. A term I came across was that we don't actually live in a democracy or a constitutional democracy. We live in a constitutional monarchy. And I think that tells you a lot about the state of play of democracy in this country, just by listening to I think, one of the most descriptive terms of the British polity that I've heard in a long while. And PR is a part of that. It's a small part of that. I think I always tell this to enthusiasts of PR in my own party. It's not a silver bullet. It's not a panacea. But it does begin the process, I think, as you quite beautifully put it, of beginning to knock the balls in different directions. And by God, does British politics need to get rid of some of the silt and the clog that is clogging up the British political system and the ability for us to make decisions in a democratic way. We all know the statistic that Boris Johnson was elected with an 88 seat majority with 44% of the popular vote. That's simply not acceptable in a modern kind of democratic state, the one that we like to think that we inhabit, but sadly don't. So we understand the democratic deficit and that this